So good morning, everybody. Hello, my name is Carl Skooglud. Welcome to First Teachings. So this morning, I would like to offer up two things. First, I happened across a teaching in the Majjhima Nikaya recently, the Middle Length Discourses, that I thought would be good to share. It's called the Canki Sutta. And in it, we see how the Buddha interacted with some Brahmin priests. Now, the Buddha had some fairly profound disagreements with the Brahmins' worldview, but what the Buddha does in this sutta is offers a way to relate to what we think is true and valuable in such a way that it helps us to avoid conflict. And animosity. And so it's just that skill, that framework, it's always helpful, but it just seems especially important to us in this world, these days and at this time. How do we relate to people that we disagree with? How do we relate to what we think is true? The second thing I'd like to do this morning is offer, before I take, I'm going to be taking a little break from teaching, from this teaching commitment. And I want to offer a few reflections on what I hope to have accomplished, in these last 4 years since Joe Cooper, thank you, Joe, asked if I would teach this class. After that, we'll have a chance to sit and we'll have a good amount of time, I hope, for questions and discussion. So again, going on to this first sutta. It's funny, I didn't realize until recently that there's a whole section in the Middle Length Discourses, the Majjhima Nikaya, that describes the kinds of encounters that the Buddha had with members of the Brahmin priestly class of his day. And the section is called the Brahmana Vagga, or the division on Brahmins, and it includes sutras numbers 91 through 100. The social setup at the time, you're probably aware, is that there was an early version of the caste system. So that the caste system was there, but from my understanding is that it wasn't as fixed and intricate as it is now. Nevertheless, there were the Brahmins, there were the nobilities, the nobility/warrior caste, and then there were merchants and laborers. Now, the Brahmins, interestingly, or maybe not surprisingly, said they were on top. But at the time, some of the nobility happened to say, no, actually, we're on top. So that there was still that kind of a debate going on. At any rate, floating outside of all of this were a group called the Samanas, the ascetic wanderers. And this is the sort of category of people that the Buddha fell into. He was an ascetic wanderer. One of the themes we find in the division on the Brahmins that I think is very helpful, very important for us these days to consider, is that whenever the Brahmins would try to assert their hereditary, birth-related, superior status, or in fact assign anyone to any category, high or low, based on birth characteristics, the Buddha's response inevitably was not so. That's not the way it is. Instead, the Buddha said that anyone, forget the superficial birth characteristics, can be of high or low character. So the characteristics you happen to be born with, are not what matters. Instead, it's what you do, it's how you act that determines your status. In this sense, the Buddha and Martin Luther King Jr. would have, they had a lot of overlap. Anyway, that's not what the Canki Sutta is about, but I wanted to put that out there in case you're interested in taking a dive into that particular division. It's quite interesting, I think. What we do find in this particular sutta, the Canki Sutta, it's Majjhima Nikaya 95, is that it starts out with one high-ranking Brahmin, member of the Brahmin class. His name was Canki, and he hears good things about the Buddha. And so he sets himself up to go visit the Buddha. While a number of his fellow Brahmins say, sir, he's just a samana, a wandering ascetic. And you're high ranking. So you shouldn't go to see him. He should come to see you. Right? They're basically saying you outclass him. But Canki says, no, Master Gotama is worthy of great respect. I'm going to go see him. So he left with a good number of his fellow Brahmins. And when Canki's group meets the Buddha, there's one precocious Brahmin. He was about 16 years old. His name is Kapatika. He asks the Buddha, first states and then asks a question. He says, we Brahmins have preserved the ancient hymns and scriptures, the Vedas, by way of our oral transmission. And we come to the definite conclusion, only this is true. Anything else is wrong. And then he asks the Buddha, what do you think of this? And the Buddha responds, how could you know for sure? That the hymns and the scriptures are true. Did the original composers say this? Have the past members of your lineage said this, going back 7, 8 generations? And Kapatika says no, which I think is interesting because it kind of seems to indicate that whatever sureness the Brahmins of the time had, it's something that was kind of particular to that particular generation. And the Buddha's response is saying, no, they didn't say this, is that, well, then you are like a line of blind men, each in touch with the other, yet the first one does not see, the middle one does not see, and the last one does not see. So this being the case, doesn't the Brahmins turn out to be groundless? So this is a good example of how the Buddha, particularly with his fellow ascetics and Brahmins, his language was not sort of soft and comforting, right? This is in contrast to how he dealt with lay people. He was uniformly sort of relaxed and patient with lay people. And this statement of the Buddha reminds me of how Buddhist Pali scholar Andrew Orlinsky once said, that the Buddha was a hard ass. Those are his words. Well, after the Buddha made this statement, he went on to say, there are these 5 things that can turn out in 2 different ways. So here are the 5 things. There's faith, there's preference, and these are the ways of arriving at truth, right? There's faith, there's preference, there's tradition, there's cognitive reasoning, and then there's acceptance after comparing views. So we can pause a moment, so here's the Buddha saying there are 5 ways that we might come to think of something as true. Or it might even get to the point of saying, only this is true, everything else is wrong, just like Kapatika is saying. So just to go through those 5. So first, you have faith in something, right? It's just something that you trust. Sada is the Pali word here that's getting translated as faith. And it literally means to place your heart upon something, to place your heart upon something. So that's the first way of arriving at the truth, or coming into thinking something is true. Second, we have a certain personal preference for a particular truth. It's simply something that we like. It's a truth, you might say, that's pleasurable to us. Right? And I think this one is really important to look out for, because it's become fairly known. Maybe the Buddha stated this in some early teachings, but I have heard this quite recently, that it's very common for us to arrive at a truth statement, buy into it because we have a positive gut reaction to it. We might have a negative gut reaction to something, but either way, it's a gut reaction. And then it's only afterwards that we use our intellect to justify our reaction, to rationalize our intuition. So that's something to, again, I think it's helpful to keep a close eye on, when we veer that direction ourselves. The third way to come to truth is to simply accept what's been passed down to us, by tradition. We accept truth based on some outside authority, or what our family believes, or our friends or our community. We hear something and we go along with it. Fourth, we can think things out. We can use our powers of reasoning, use our intellect to figure out something and then say this is true. And fifth, we can contemplate all the different views, that happen to swirl around a particular subject. Weigh all the different opinions and then, come to accept one as true. So there are those 5 ways, that we can come into seeing something as true, which I think is a pretty good summary. And then after that, the Buddha goes on to say, well, with each of these 5 cases, it can turn out 2 different ways. First is that you may conclude that something is true when it's actually false, or you may conclude that something is false when it's actually true. Then the Buddha says, this being the case, it's not good for someone who cares about protecting and preserving the truth to come to definite conclusions. Okay. And Kapatika, the young boy at this point, he kind of asks, well, what are we to do then? How do we protect and preserve truth? Good question. And then the Buddha offers him, he offers us, a way of phrasing it, a way of framing it, for other people and within our own minds, such that we acknowledge what we think, but we hold it lightly. Right? We hold it lightly. We can say, for example, I arrived at this truth because it's what I trust, right? But I haven't come to a definite conclusion. Or, I arrived at this because it's what I like. I'll be upfront about it. Or I arrived at this because it's my tradition. Or I arrived at this because this is how I thought about it. Here's how I reasoned it out. And then finally, I arrived at this because, this is how I've juggled and weighed all the various points of view. When I come down, I come to accept one particular one, perhaps. But I haven't come to a definite conclusion. So it's not that we throw our hands up in the air and we give up. It does not mean that we don't align ourselves with what we think is true and right. But what the Buddha is saying, recommending, is that we remain humble. And in my mind, 2 very good things come about as a result of this. And this is why I wanted to share this sutta with you this morning. First, it helps us to avoid external conflict. And second, it helps to relieve us of internal dukkha, It could help to avoid external conflict, because our energy, the type of energy, we're bringing when we're interacting with each other, with others rather, instead of being like, here's how it is, and our mind is made up. Instead, our approach is more relaxed. It's like, here's how I see it. Right? We present, our truth as being our perspective rather than as being something absolute. Now, just that, this just seems like it'd be incredibly helpful. I mean, you might practice this already. This may not be new information to you, but just to have this crop up and pop up in a 2,500-year-old text, I really enjoyed it when I encountered it. So that's the external part. The internal benefit of taking this more relaxed approach is that it decreases so much of our own dukkha. The dukkha that comes from clinging to our opinions, grasping tightly onto them. It also puts us in the position of being more nimble in our opinions. We become open to changing our minds. And the funny thing is, we might become open to others, when they're putting something out on the table in the same way that, we hope, that we expect that they will be open to us when we're putting something out on the table. The thing, just to wrap up a little bit, is I think this really ties into the mutual benefit aspect of our practice, because what a relief it is, what a gift to both ourselves and to others when we're more relaxed in our opinions. So this discussion in the Canki Sutta, took place between spiritual leaders, and in the Buddha's day, there was a lot of competition and debate among spiritual thinkers. You get a sense that this happened quite a bit in the early text. It comes off almost as a form of entertainment, sort of an emotional contact sport. The Buddha didn't hesitate to debate, but he refrained from a lot of the other kinds of sort of more superfluous debates that others got themselves involved in. Now, this approach, in case it's not already abundantly clear, this is a debate that takes place in a spiritual context, but it can also be applicable to any number of situations, in our work environment, our political environment, family dynamics, just generally moving around in the world. So that's most of what I wanted to point out about this teaching. And I think that just that part of it, offers us so much wisdom to work with. But I do want to let you know that in the sutta, the Buddha does go on to say that one can awaken to truth. Faith, can move from something that we, place our heart upon into something that's verified. There can be a verification. The way the Buddha puts it in the sutta is that there can be what he calls a discovery of truth. So there can be an endpoint. We don't have to forever hang out in that mental space of, well, maybe. Maybe yes, maybe no. He says that we do this. There's a little bit of a list I'm going to throw at you. We do this by first, gauging the character of the people who are offering us their truth. And see if they're motivated by greed or by hatred or by delusion. Right? We take time to gauge that. And then second, if we think they're reputable, of good character, then we place faith in him or her. We get back to faith. And then third, we listen to and we memorize their teachings. Fourth, we examine the teachings and we strive to put them into practice. All right. And then finally, we realize the teachings, the truth for ourselves with what he calls insightful wisdom. So there is an endpoint. There can be an endpoint. One thing to keep in mind about all this is that, there are, in fact, all kinds of truths that we could, in fact, come into, based on this approach. And of all the things that there are out there to possibly explore, ponder, and examine, the Buddha focused famously, on two things. He focused on, as he said, that the reason he taught was to understand dukkha and to bring dukkha to an end. Along these lines, he said at one point that the truths that are out there are like the leaves of the forest, but what he actually taught was a handful of leaves. Just a handful of leaves. So that's all I'd like to say about that one sutta, Majjhima Nikaya 95. I hope that was helpful. The second thing I'd like to share, second thing I'd like to speak to is that, yes, I'm taking some time off from teaching, and I want to offer a few reflections on the last 4 years of teaching this class and how I hope I've offered some things that have helped point it out, some of the early teachings that will help. First thing that I want to just put out there is, clarify why I focus on the first teachings. Why do that? Just a little background. When I first encountered the Buddhist tradition, it was by way of a class called Introduction to Vipassana, taught by a person named Avtar Brock, who we now know as, this is 1993, now she's now known as Tara Brock. Well, I loved that class and pretty quickly felt at home within this tradition. And I also really started to dive into the history of the tradition, and all the manifestations that have come up in its 2,600 years. And as you may know, all the different forms, of the Buddha Dhamma, the Theravada, the Mahayana, the Zen, Tibetan, they had existed historically pretty much separate from each other. And there was interaction, but there wasn't a whole lot of interaction. But these days, we get easy access to all those Buddhist traditions, at the same time. And then we mix all those historic forms with our own Western traditions. Psychology, romanticism, scientific rationalism, perennialism, and by the way, there's a great book, if this is a subject that's interesting to you, there's a great book called Buddhist Modernism by David McMahon that describes how these contemporary Buddhist ideas, have interacted with various Buddhist frameworks. It's very academic, but you can get past some of the language. It's really, really interesting. Sort of the Kama of our current Dhamma, you might say. The point is that, all this, it's really eclectic and dynamic. And if you love an all-you-can-eat buffet, then this is your time and place in the world, right? But the thing is, given my own sort of personality, my own personality, I experienced all this great bounty more as a food fight in a high school cafeteria. and it was just a little hard for me to take in. There were just too many variations and views for me to really be able to, settle in and practice well. That was just my thing. That being the case, about 20 years ago, I decided to start at the beginning, with the Pali Canon, which is the best source we have of what the Buddha and his early followers thought and taught. And it's just, again, I just haven't found much of a need to vary from that since. It's not a matter of dogmatism. It's just, I've got plenty to work with here in my own mind. And I like to share these first teachings because I think they still have the power to, help us understand dukkha and to bring it to an end. Just one other kind of funny thing that I want to point out is that, I'm an architect, and here I am teaching this 2,600-year-old tradition. If you look on the IMCW website, I'm referred to as a teacher, and I've gone through some teacher training. But in my own mind, I consider myself to be more of a senior student, you might say, or a Kalyanamitta, a spiritual friend, or just a trail guide, somebody who's been along a particular path, very familiar with it and can point out a few things, avoid that, might want to look into that. And just one thing too about what you may have noticed as my approach to teaching is that when necessary, I don't mind pointing out differences between Buddhist traditions and between our own contemporary traditions and the early teachings. It's not that I enjoy being contrary. I'm not interested in creating conflict or anything, but where there are genuine differences between the culture and the Buddha Dhamma, I think it's important to be clear about them, right? Just otherwise, what would be the point of this class? If everything was, if everybody's saying the exact same thing. I'd like to take a few minutes now to offer a quick reminder of some of the teachings that we've covered since we started out back in 2018. As is my way, I'm going to throw a bunch of information at you. And what I recommend is, just stay attentive to what particular parts perk you up. Right. And then, maybe on your own, you can go back and take a second pass at some of these teachings, on your own time, at your own pace. So the first teaching that I want to recall is the Sabbasava Sutta, which we find in Majjhima Nikaya 2. It's the second in the Majjhima Nikaya, Middle Length Discourses. It's got a number of translations, for example, all the taints or all the effluents, or, some of the translations get pretty aggressive, like all the corruptions. The literal translation of the Pali word asava, though, sab-asava, is to flow. So it's describing an act of movement. All right. And what's moving, is our mind. Right. And in the sutta, there are 3 asavas. They act kind of as compulsions. So in my own mind, I kind of translate it as all the compulsions. They compel the mind to move. The first compulsion is to go after sense pleasure. The second compulsion is to create states of becoming. This one's describing how we create little mental worlds. and then we live in them. We get caught in them. And the third, the mind tends to get compelled towards ignorance rather than towards the Four Noble Truths. These are not set, but these are things that can take over quickly if we're not sort of clued into them. The one thing that I want to highlight about this sutta is that it sets up a framework in which that describes how attention works. And in it, attention either steers us toward or away from these three asavas. Right? We can gear our attention such that the asavas get strengthened or they get diminished, they get weakened. And just by the way, being free of the asavas was one of the very common expressions of being liberated back in the early texts. So with this framework, the Buddha sets it out such that attention is either appropriate or inappropriate. Manasikara is attention, and yoniso or ayoniso is appropriate or inappropriate. So the difference here that I want to point out is that this is not a framework in which we establish bare attention. Right? In the suttas framework, the question is, are we giving our attention over to something that's causing us a problem or that's helping us out? And one great example of this that happens right at the beginning of the sutta is how the Buddha said that if we give our attention over to questions of self, questions like, what am I? Then we create for ourselves, and then he gives a long list. He says we create a thicket of views, a wilderness of views, a contortion of views, a fetter of views. Right? A fetter being a chain, it's a manacle, right? So with the Buddha at this point, what he's doing here is he's having us set aside a whole category of questioning. Don't pay attention to that, he's saying. We'll drive ourselves nuts trying to figure out what am I? And in his mind, even if you think you come to a conclusion, it doesn't free us up. It doesn't have to do with freedom. In contrast, what he said, does constitute correct attention, appropriate attention, is giving our attention over to the Four Noble Truths. That's an exploration that will help us. So moving on to another text. The next one that we covered was what's called the Samaditi Sutta, or the teaching on right view. That's Majjhima Nikaya number 9. You may recall, we took, for some of these, it's not like we covered this in one class. Some of these we took quite a long time with. So I'm giving you the very, very expedited version of some of these teachings, just hitting some of the highlights. Well, in this one, the Samaditi Sutta, the Buddha sets out a number of themes that are to be considered views that are right, quote unquote. Right in the sense of being appropriate to the goals of the path. Right? Not so much right in terms of right and wrong, but they align with these are the views that align with liberation. Okay. The first thing that he sets out as constituting, right view is that there is such a thing as skillful and unskillful, kusala and akusala. skillful and unskillful, in particular, thoughts, words, and actions. Right? For example, killing is unskillful. This is some of the very basic, straightforward stuff he lays out right at the beginning. Lying is unskillful. So we get that part straight and correct right at the beginning. Second thing he says is that the Four Noble Truths are part of right view. Dukkha, the cause of dukkha, the end of dukkha, and the path leading to the end of dukkha. Third, it's in this sutta where we got into the 12 parts of paticca samuppada, or dependent origination, dependent arising. That is quite a heavy lift, but we did take some time with it. I won't go through all 12 parts, but I'll focus on just a couple. This is the sutta, or the parts of dependent origination that I want to highlight are first, the component of what's called sense contact. We have contact at any one of the six senses, the five bodily sensations plus mind. And based on any of the six versions of sense contact, we experience pleasure or pain. Right? Pleasure or pain being the next one down the line. Pleasure and pain are followed by craving. Clinging follows craving. Clinging leads to becoming, again, which we experience as those little mental worlds of existence. And then after creating those worlds of existence, the next component is that we live out certain lives within those worlds. Eventually, those worlds come to an end, they grow old and die, and the whole process is thought of as being dukkha. So I want to point out two things about this. First is that the classic exit point from this process, the classic point at which we can free ourselves up, is between Vedana and Tanha, meaning that pleasure and pain are inevitable, the Tanha part, but the craving, the Vedana part, pleasure and pain are that's the translation of Vedana, but the craving part, Tanha, is optional, right? That's the part we can opt out of, such that dukkha can come to an end. The second thing I want to point out about this, and it's something that Tansaro Bhikkhu likes to, I think, helpfully point out, is that prior to sense contact, which we might tend to think of as bare and objective, in this framework of the Buddhas, elements of intention are going on before sense contact. And this is why, for example, when a pickpocket sees a saint, he sees the saint's pockets. Right? I think the way to make sense of that is that, the pickpocket has some prior intentional motivations that color what he sees when he sees a saint. Right? Does that make sense? We have an intention prior to having a sight, having a smell, and on down the line. Okay. So next, we spent time with Digha Nikaya 2, the long discourse, the second sutta in the long discourses, which is the teaching on the fruits of the contemplative life, the Samanyapala Sutta. Now, you may recall that this is the one in which there's a king who has just killed his father in order to take over the throne. And in the opening of the sutta, he's being racked by guilt. And what he does is he wants to seek out some sort of a spiritual teacher that can somehow, I don't know how he thinks this will work, but he wants a spiritual teacher who can make him feel better. So King Ajatasattu was his name. He and his retinue, they find the Buddha. The Buddha gets recommended to the king. They go find him, and the Buddha gives him a teaching. For us, the teaching turns out to be a great explanation, a great outline of the step-by-step process of becoming liberated. So to begin, first you go forth, which just simply means, you commit to being on the path. Then you focus on your ethical life. You just make sure that there's nothing going on there that's getting in your way. Then you do what's called guard the senses, which sounds a little restrictive, and it's something that we might recoil from, have a gut reaction, have a negative gut reaction to. But all it's simply pointing to is the idea that we stay careful not to make attraction, aversion, or delusion with what arises in our sixth sense fields, or sixth sense gates. If you think of it that way, it's like, well, yeah, that would be really nice. So after we've, worked with guarding the sense gates, then we develop what's called sati sampajanya. Sati being mindfulness and sampajanya being clear awareness. The two work together. Then after that, in the sutta, we make ourselves content with our material state. For the monks and nuns, it meant being satisfied with, our robes, our food, our shelter, our medicine. After that, the next part of the process is to abandon the hindrances, the 5 hindrances. And then right after abandoning the hindrances, you develop samadhi, the jhanas. And the intent there is to help the heart and the mind become clear, settled, calm. And it's based on a calm, clear, settled mind that we develop insight. Right? It's that point where the mind is clear enough that our insight can become really strong. On the heels of that insight, interestingly, the Buddha gives us a list of supernormal powers, which we don't quite buy into these days, but to people at the time, they were a way to sort of prove your level of realization. So in the sutta, that's something that's included. But it's really based on the development of insight that we go on next to bring an end to the asavas and realize actualize the reality of the Four Noble Truths, and we become liberated. Okay, so that was sort of near the end of the teaching, and it's the reason I like that one is that it does set out a fairly, if you like process, this is one version of the process that we might want to experiment with. The Noble Eightfold Path is a list of elements, a list of ingredients, you might say, but this teaching provides a way to sort of order the different elements of the path, in a way that personally I find really helpful. I am starting to wind down here a little bit if you're feeling saturated. So just want to give you that little reality check. So another teaching that we spent time on was Majjhima Nikaya 19, which is the teaching on two kinds of thought. The Veda Vitaka Sutta is the Pali phrase for it. In this sutta, the Buddha describes how he practiced before he became awakened. And what he did was to classify his thoughts according to whether they related to either sense desire on the one hand or renunciation on the other. Ill will on the one hand or goodwill on the other. Cruelty on the one hand or compassion on the other. And what he did was to abandon the first set of pairs and develop the second set of pairs. He decided that that's what he did to establish as a practice. And the important part of the teaching is that it shows how the Buddha, it's sort of a subtle point, but he didn't deny or suppress stuff that was going on within him, although that's how it can get perceived. So perceived by us these days. Instead, the approach, I think the more helpful and I guess more accurate way of describing his approach is that, when things came up, again, he didn't suppress them, but he would immediately ask, does this help or does this hurt? Does it help me and those around me, or does it harm me and those around me? So it isn't a question of whether all the stuff that comes up within us, whether they represent aspects of a self. Instead, it was whether these states do us any good. So are they helpful? So next one and the last one is that I'll speak to is the renowned Satipatthana Sutta. Found in it's Majjhima Nikaya 10 or 22. There's a longer version in the Digha Nikaya, the long discourses. So it's in this teaching of, it's translated as the foundations of mindfulness or the establishments of mindfulness, that we abide contemplating four things. Anupassana is the word for abide, contemplating. We abide contemplating body, feelings, and mind. Kaya, Vedana, Chitta. These first three things, you might think of as the great givens. They're kind of there, but with the fourth Satipatthana, we find an overlay that gets interwoven into those three. And it's basically a collection of the Buddhist teachings. The fourth Satipatthana is referred to as the Dhammas, and it's basically five kinds of teachings that get folded back into the others, which are the hindrances, the aggregates, sense gates, 7 factors of awakening, and the Four Noble Truths. All right. In this teaching, we do, of course, find mindfulness, sati, but it's mixed with a number of other elements in order to make mindfulness part of the path. Mindfulness is actually sort of a neutral term. We can bring to mind anything. With right mindfulness, though, we bring to mind things that are skillful, that are helpful. And that's where the first other aspect comes into play, which is ardency. Mindfulness gets mixed with ardency, which again means bringing something to mind that helps us. It's an expression of right effort. And then furthermore, I think it's an expression of goodwill, of metta. We're doing something that helps. Mindfulness is also mixed with sampajanya, which means that we become clearly aware of what we've brought to mind. Next, another part of the equation, you might say, is that we set aside mundane attractions and concerns. It's not that we give up caring about the world, but we take times when there are times when we focus on practice, such that we actually have a chance to benefit from the teachings. And then, of course, there's the 7-part refrain, in which we apply yet another sort of layer of perceptions to all of this. So we apply this matrix of elements in the refrain. We apply this mixture of elements to ourselves, to others, and to all people. It's the first 3 parts of the refrain. And then we dive into the conditionality of all these elements in the matrix, how elements arise, how they pass away, or, how they both arise and pass away. And then in the 7th part of the frame, we also have this option of simply keeping something in mind, applying bare knowledge and mindfulness to it, as it said. So as you know, we've been working with the simile of the cook, found in the Sutta. And in that one, we get advice to sensitize ourselves to what within this great list of mindfulness is this great list of mindfulness possibilities. Sensitize ourselves to what parts our hearts and minds respond to. You don't have to keep all of it in our head. But it does help us to clue into what we find interesting, find enlivening and engaging, such that we have a chance to settle into and really benefit from the practice. The last thing that I'd like to say about mindfulness, and it's a drum that you've heard me beat very often over these 4 years, is that in Buddhism's early texts, in its first teachings, mindfulness is proactive in nature. It's proactive in nature. In Buddhism's first teachings, there's a profound acknowledgement that experience is an interactive process. It's not something that's just happening. It's an interactive process. And it's mindfulness that helps us to steer our own course within that process, within experience. Right? That's the great power of it. So I will end there. That's a little bit of a big summary to ponder, at your leisure, as you see fit, depending on what might have interested you. I'd like to give ourselves a chance now to settle down a little bit, have a quick sit. If you'd like to stretch for a moment or adjust your posture, please feel free. So I might have kicked up quite a lot of dust at this point, but I'd like to, hopefully you can let most of my words fall away, come into your own experience. It might help to start by just paying attention to your physical posture, Let your eyes close if you like. And if need be, adjust your posture so that it's upright and relaxed. And then take a deep in breath and then release that breath. Breathe in deeply, feel your body. Breathe out and relax. Breathe in deeply, feel your body. Breathe out and relax. And then during this brief settling in period, I invite you to do what I think of as check the weather. Just acknowledge what we're bringing into these moments. How is our body feeling? What sensations are prominent? What sorts of pleasure or discomfort might you be experiencing right now? What thoughts or emotions or moods might be there right now? Just check out what's going on. Be clear for yourself. It is part of the path just to be clear, to clearly comprehend these moments of experience. Again, what bodily sensations are prominent? What are you finding to be pleasurable or uncomfortable in these moments? Thoughts, emotions, moods. It is helpful to clearly comprehend what's going on in these moments, but perhaps the most liberating part of this path is that no matter what is happening in this moment's experience, we can chart our own course within it. We don't have to be content with what old karma has kicked up. We don't have to be dragged along by old patterns. Instead, we can guide ourselves. We can guide ourselves in directions that we think will help make those directions strong. So in that way, you might like to visualize, you might like to bring to mind how you would like your heart and mind to be. Why are you practicing? What would you like to have happen? What good things would you like to have happen to yourself? in these moments in this community. Bring those good things to mind and see if they're possible right now. If you find the mind drifting off into thought forms, creating little worlds, little bubbles of reality, see if you can pop out of them as quickly as you can and reestablish yourself in something that you know to be good for yourself, something beneficial. the Buddha said that by looking after oneself, one looks after others. And that by looking after others, one looks after oneself. And how does one look after oneself? By looking after others, by patience, by non-harming, by loving kindness, by caring for others. And how does one look after others? By looking after oneself, by practicing mindfulness, by developing it, by practicing it a lot. And so may our time here together be a benefit to ourselves and to all those around us. So we have some time to speak a little with each other, ask questions, offer up thoughts, talk things out. Yes, Deb, hi.
The beginning of your talk where you talked about knowing the truth and whether it's putting your heart in faith or preference or the acceptance from based on your family and the culture and or intellect, or I mean, it just resonated with me. I mean, I grew up Unitarian, which was such a composite of things that it was actually hard to understand, because what was it? You know, and when Christians would come and say, come, be Baptist like me, it was like, yeah, but I still don't know who that Holy Spirit is. So just thinking about talking to people who have different views like that, it's just incredible. And like everything else that I've had with First Teachings, it's just been such a wonderful perspective. And I will hold my beliefs lightly and humbly, and be open to other people's ideas. But that was such a confirmation. So that's what I was thinking, Carl.
Thank you, Deb. Yeah, maybe that set of five was something that they all kind of make sense in their own way, but to have them laid out so clearly, there's something about the naming of it for me that really helps to bring it to life, rather than having something that sort of vaguely floats in the background. To have the Buddha come out and say it, was a big help to hear.
Yeah, it is.
I think it has been perhaps a little accidentally helpful that we've been talking about the Sutta near the end of this, because it is, like I said, focused on all this material.
Yes.
It's a very large handful of leaves, I must say. But what within all of that, do we really connect with? And don't be afraid to just sort of focus on that and really let it guide you. Yes, Alex. Hey.
Hi, everyone. Carl, I wanted to thank you for the time and work and dedication you've given to this class. I've missed the past 6 months, but I was there for most of the rest of the 4 years. I didn't even realize it had been 4, which is an incredible effort on your part. And I love that you finished with this teaching about holding truths lightly, because our beliefs, there are sources of pain from all different areas in life, but one of them is simply what we believe, which can be painful, especially, obviously not just in the political environment, but across the board. So thank you for finishing with that one. And just thank you in general, Carl.
Thank you for saying. Yes, Alon.
Hi, Carl. First of all, I want to thank you very much. That was, again, an excellent class. I'm sorry I've missed several over the last, time flies, right? Tempus fugit. Several years. I know I'm going to miss you in these classes. I was going to also throw out there, although I'm not the best of students, whether you had some thoughts or others around the Zoom room have thoughts about whether and how we should remain in touch or continue and deepen these lessons, even though we'll miss you. But yeah, you do an awesome job, and I look forward to your return. But have a good break in the interim. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Ralph. Hey.
Hey, Carl. I just wanted to thank you as well for the last 4 years. It just really has been so helpful I feel it's just so deep into my connection to Buddhism and my understanding, and been such useful tools in my life. So just wanted to say thank you. And as with everyone else, hope to see you again, either in person for Dharma talks or
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
It's ironic. I see a number of new faces, so this is the first time we'll see you. Will be the last for a while. Yes, Hila. Is that how you say that?
Yeah, Hila. Thank you so much. And this was my first time, and now I'm really looking forward to catching the recordings. I really appreciated you just naming that it can be, or at least how I was feeling it, overwhelming to have access to so much information and teachings. And I think over the years, that's been a hindrance for me, is just kind of trying to find a way that feels right. And I think getting easily distracted by the many possibilities and many paths. And so I appreciated you just saying that, just find the thing that you're feeling, whatever that's helping you, and then just keep going with that. I wonder also to what degree was that part of the Buddha's teachings? I don't, that each person should really figure out their own way into this, as opposed to just following some school or some way of doing things. Is that is that sort of one of the bigger teachings, that it's a very personal path?
I'm not sure that the Buddha said that a whole lot other than in that one teaching, the Sutta. But what people had the benefit of back then is that the Buddha would get to know you and then personalize what he taught you. So in a way, it was appropriate. He would teach you what he thought was appropriate given kind of where you're at. So in a way, yeah, it kind of narrowed it down a lot to kind of respond to your question. So for us, we just kind of, again, we have so much to work with. So don't, it helped me so much too, just to be able to settle down and just focus on one thing and sort of not, try to avoid, like it's just to continue with the buffet analogy, you've got your plate full of food, but when you sit down at the table, you're looking over at somebody else's going like, oh, I should have got that. Or, there's a little bit of envy, or that's a kind of a distracting point, but it can be distracting from what you actually have in front of you. For those of us who have been on the path for a while, though, that if you focus on one thing, it's going to branch out and eventually cover a lot of the other bases. So you'll get there. Mm-hmm. It'll branch out, and don't worry too much about what you're missing out on, because it'll connect eventually.
That's super helpful. Thank you.
Good. Joe Cooper, hello.
Hello, Carl Skooglud. And hello, Sangha. And of course, I want to tell you how much I've appreciated these 4 years. I remember dragging you into that coffee shop and actually begging you to do this class. Bless your heart. It has been sublime. It really has been. And so many nourishing things that we can refer to again and again. I have copious notes and I do look at them. And so thank you. And I want to say about today, a kind of a common expression that one hears that isn't from the Pali Canon probably is the Buddha's supposedly saying, be a light unto yourself. That you hear all the time. And that was one of the earliest things I ever heard when I started studying the Dharma and meditating and practicing. And really, I think it's been one of the more important statements I've heard, whether the Buddha ever said it or not. But today in the Canki Sutta, when you say, when you reach insightful wisdom, and that becomes that kind of endpoint, I think, as you and Hilo were just kind of talking about, I do think that we do peruse and engage with all kinds of different aspects of the teaching. And in so doing, we, and kind of gauging our own hearts and minds, I think we do arrive at a place of insightful wisdom, and there are many ways to get there, and also another statement that I learned early on, which again the Buddha probably didn't say, was probably Thich Nhat Hanh actually, who said, the ideal is not to know everything. The ideal is for the soil to be open to the rain of awareness. And I kind of feel that's also what we've been talking about today, and some of the suttas that we've already studied, and the awareness and the awakening that can provide, those processes can provide, and to be free to see what's right here in our experience, as you said in that beautiful meditation that you did, which I loved. I always love your meditations. They're the best. So thank you, Carl. Such a pleasure.
Well, I appreciate the invite from way back. It's just funny how one little interaction can, lead to such amazing things. It's been amazing for me. I'm not checking out totally, but yeah, it's a good time for me to take a little break.
Hi, like Hila, this
Hi.
is my first and last time as well, because since you are taking the break. But it's pretty amazing that I have been living near Tara Brach's place of the talks for over 20 years, and not until the last 4 I had found it. I used to go to New York for a group, and it was pretty incredible. And in the last 4 years, I'm trying to discover who I really am. And I think what I have been doing, why I am so moved by this lecture that you gave, thank you so much for your time and wisdom, is to find out my willingness to drop control and to find out who I really am. I don't know. And your talk gave me a lot of food for thoughts. And the idea that mindfulness is active, it's mind-boggling to me.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. I offer that as something to play around with. It's easy to encounter teachings that are kind of a lot more scaled back than what the way I present it. But again, it's not something to just take on faith. I don't want you to take my word for it, but it's just play around with it for yourself and see how you like it. See how it works for you. But yeah, it was a huge transition for me as well. Probably about 2005 or so when I first started reading Tony Sorrow's books and Sarah Bhikkhu's books. It's just the way he presented it was, and he teaches from the early texts. It was a really different paradigm, but one that, as you can tell, I found helpful over the years. Yeah, Tani Saro Bhikkhu, THANISSARO. Yeah, Tani Saro Bhikkhu. He has a lot of stuff on access to insight. Well, I'm happy to hang out a little longer if people would like to stay on, respect people's time. It's been a really good run, to be continued.